This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. How has the shrinking of the middle class changed the American dream? Professor Sandra Hanson says the dream is now more spiritual than material. Economic analyst Mike Konczal points out that when conservatives say we should go back to before the New Deal when private sector charity took care of the poor, they're misinformed. It was never that way. And Bill Press talks about House Republicans and LGBT issues with Representative Mark Pocan. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Catholic University professor Sandra Hanson has been looking into the American dream, and as we approach the annual celebration of American independence, she says we need that dream even more when times are tough. And we say hello to Sandra Hanson, who's a professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America and a fellow at the university's Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies. She is co-editor of a book, The American Dream in the 21st Century, in which she and a group of contributors examine the American dream and consider its intersection with politics, religion, race, gender, and generation. Sandra Hanson, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I guess an obvious first question. What is the American dream, and is it different for everyone?
Yeah. It is many things to different people at different times in history. But, you know, one thing is been the same. It's resilient. It's an old dream, and I think it's still holding strong. Part of the resilience is due to the fact that it's closely tied with these deeply held values of freedom and equality of opportunity, and also the special allure since we're a nation of immigrants. So I think immigrants have expanded our sense of who we are as Americans, and that's a little interesting in a time when there's some anti-immigrant sentiments and due to probably the recession. But it is definitely meant to be things for different people. It used to be a more communal dream about a good society, and now it's changed a little bit towards wealth, but I see that changing again.
Well, how much of the dream, however you define it, is just simply an expression of white middle-class values?
Yeah, that is something to think about. It's a concern of ours. Maybe the alarm bell is ringing on the dream. We've got some crises in jobs and healthcare, and we have a lot of media attention on the state of the dream. And the discussion is usually what I see is a fear for the white middle-class American who maybe historically personified the dream and who maybe is now a little concerned that this, and I say in quotes, deserving middle class might be feeling that it's less attainable. But they sometimes feel if others, white middle class others, don't achieve the dream, maybe they didn't work hard enough. So there's large divides by race, class, and gender, and even a dream if we don't make sure it's available to all.
You contend that the American dream is older than America itself. I mean, how can that be, and where did it come from?
Yeah, that it's kind of how can an American dream start before America? Well, it goes back to the founders. Our Declaration of Independence promises citizens of this new nation certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which often ended in fulfillment. Alec de Tocqueville came over here in 1831, and he noticed this charm of anticipated success amongst Americans. But really, even before the American Revolution, you saw this group of people fighting for certain rights and freedoms, and that's pre-revolution, and that's a part of why the first group came here to fight for these democracies.
We're speaking with Sandra Hanson, professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America, fellow at the university's Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies. Has the dream, and you touched on it a little bit earlier when you mentioned wealth, but has it evolved over time to emphasize other aspects of success, say education, class?
Yes, absolutely. I think education isn't a place it's evolved. I think that has always been there. I think every immigrant group has seen this as a ladder, and Obama used that same metaphor in one of his very well-received talks, that we see education as a ladder for success, and almost every immigrant group has done that. But here's the thing. It did change towards wealth, but John Zogby, who's one of the authors of the book, has been pulling on the American dream for years, and he noticed a change after 9/11 and after the recession, where Americans are starting to maybe think more about a spiritual aspect of the dream and less about wealth. So about a job that one enjoys, about time with family, about a community of people where opportunities are more equalized.
How does the American dream manifest itself among immigrants? Are immigrants from Mexico different from, say, the Eastern European immigrants of the late 19th century in their view of America?
Yeah, that's, you would think so, but I have to almost say no. There's some almost universality, and when I say resilience, it's this constancy through all of these difficult times. America has seen some difficult times, but these new immigrants from Mexico and other places are very, very hopeful. In fact, Jim, we find them they are stronger believers in the American dream than any other current race, ethnic group in the U.S., including whites. And so there's something about the dream that isn't stopped by sometimes actual realities of the difficulties, for example, that Latinos have had in achieving some of these indicators of wealth in terms of jobs and education.
If the American dream is a positive one, what do you think of the concept of American exceptionalism?
Yeah, I think that term has both a positive and a negative connotation, and perhaps both are exhibited to some extent here. We are exceptional on the dream. I would say that our culture perhaps builds it in, our history and culture, more than most other places around the world. Every American president has embodied it as a way to connect to American voters. And the more clear the language, the more successful the president. FDR, a sober, kind of moderate version during the Depression. Reagan, kind of a version with national pride and self-confidence during the Cold War. So there is indeed this view of America as a land of opportunity, both here and elsewhere. But the flip side is, and one sociologist, Seymour Martin Lipset, has talked about this exceptionalism. We are also exceptional on high poverty, homicide, little labor protection, and large prison populations.
Ouch. I mean, yes. And is that the good coming with the bad, or
that is?
Yeah.
I mean, hope is a positive thing. It's a little irresponsible to keep promoting it without making sure that it's possible.
Mm-hmm. What about other countries? Do they have their own dreams? I mean, is there a Belgian dream, a Chinese dream, that kind of thing? Or do people use that same sort of thought process when trying to achieve? Because and you mentioned presidents. I can't think of a president in my lifetime who hasn't mentioned, going for the American dream in some way.
Yes. Well, let's say this. Let's say that I don't think that we should be so ethnocentric as to say, it's only our dream. We're the only country where parents want their children to do well and to do better than them. I think that would be a bit arrogant. So Jim Cullen, he's another one of the authors on the book. He's written a lot on this topic. He looks across cultures and time. He's looked in ancient Rome. He's looked at China. He's looked at Great Britain. He finds evidence of a dream in many places. And we don't have the corner on this, but I would say also that if you're talking about amount of mobility, upward mobility, there's other places around the world, and I'm not just talking about Europe, that are doing pretty darn good. And he talks about Brazil and Chile, growing prosperity and focus on poverty programs, and that's not happening here very much. So I will end with some optimism and some hope that we need the dream, even and especially in hard times. It's not only our dream, but that it survived, and the hope is now for a new form of the dream and a new generation of dreamers.
So, Sandra, do we need to redefine the American dream as being more than just what most people allude to, and that is it's wealth, it's success, it's moving forward that way? I mean, there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Right. Absolutely. And even the surveys of Americans are showing a trending on this, away from materialism and towards the spiritual. And we have a lot of hope. And John Zogby's interviewed the young generation, and he's referring to them as the first global generation. So maybe this young generation will make their American dream more global and work for issues having to do with opportunity and freedoms at both the global and the community level, the local level, that do morph it into the things that we probably do need to think about.
Okay. Sandra Hanson, professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America and fellow at the university's Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies, joining us today to discuss the book that she is co-editor of, The American Dream in the 21st Century. Sandra, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Sure. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Research fellow Mike Konczal rips apart the notion that voluntarism in the private sector can replace government support for the neediest Americans. And we'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Let's check our weaponry. 93,000 machine guns, 533 planes and helicopters, 180,000 magazine cartridges, and 432 ambush-protected vehicles. Okay? Let's roll. Only this is not the U.S. military. It's your and my local police departments patrolling our cities. Remember Officer Friendly, the beat cops who are known as peace officers? The Friendlies have largely been transformed into militarized forces, literally armed with and garbed in war gear and indoctrinated in military psychology, rather than the ethic of community policing. 20 years ago, Congress created the Military Transfer Program, providing federal grants so chiefs of police and sheriffs could buy surplus firepower from the Pentagon. In a stunningly short time, our local police forces have become macho military units, possessing an armory of Pentagon freebies ranging from 30-ton tanks to rifle silencers. They've gone from peacekeeping beats to over-the-top SWAT team aggression, unleashed on the citizenry tens of thousands of times a year, mainly for ordinary police work. For example, a gung-ho Florida SWAT team raided area barbershops in 2010 to stop the horror of barbering without a license. And masked police in Louisiana launched a military raid on a nightclub in order to perform a liquor law inspection. This is Jim Hightower saying, militarization is a dangerous and ultimately deadly perversion of the honorable purpose of policing, and it is literally out of control. The New York Times notes that 38 states have received silencers to use in surreptitious raids. A sheriff in a North Dakota rural county with only 11,000 people told a Times reporter that he saw no need for silencers. When it was pointed out that his department had received 40 of them from the Pentagon, he was baffled, saying, "I don't recall approving them."
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. When Republicans talk about the good old days when voluntary organizations like churches and charities took care of the poor, they're fantasizing a society that never existed. Roosevelt Institute research fellow Mike Konczal explains the fallacy of voluntarism. And we say hello to Mike Konczal, fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, where he works on financial reform, unemployment, inequality, and a progressive vision of the economy. He recently wrote an article in the journal Democracy about the fantasy of voluntarism and private charity replacing the social safety net. Mike Konczal, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. Right-wingers from Ronald Reagan to Newt Gingrich to Senator Mike Lee have always argued we should go back to a time before the New Deal when government let private associations take care of the poor. But you say that time never actually existed.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of those things that once you start to listen for it, and it's, someone told me to listen to this, and I caught it with everyone, including, Mike Lee and Ted Cruz, is that they romanticize this vision of the 19th century, a period before the Great Society of LBJ, before the New Deal, even before the Progressive era, of a society that really worked and that took care of its poor and provided deep security through real bonds of community. And, you go back and you look, and it's actually not there. It's not there at all. It's not there in the sense that the federal government actually did have a very active role. It wasn't a complete role and wasn't like a coherent role, but it did provide a lot of support both for businesses and then also for individuals in terms of risk sharing and risk pooling. And then also separately, the system that was in place is not actually that great. There's a lot of poorhouses. There's a lot of, huge amounts of gaps in what people were able to actually get in terms of actual insurance. And so there's really good reasons why around this time, most of modern states added a welfare state, and the United States in particular did it during the Great Depression.
What is the basic argument in favor of a strong government safety net, even as religious, ethnic, and political machines have always done a good job taking care of their own?
Well, it became very obvious during the Great Depression, the way the system doesn't work. And there was a network, and it provided a very thin and a very fragile level of security, one that was immediately destroyed in the Great Depression. There's some great stories in the piece about Herbert Hoover and other people trying desperately to keep the system together, and ultimately just did not work. And the reasons why is that the federal government can provide security for everyone in a systemic way, right? So it doesn't have to, when you look at the old system, there's a lot of pockets. They worked, because a lot of them were through ethnic societies, or as you said, city bosses. They worked very well in a few cities, but we're a big country with a lot of different places. And so smaller cities didn't have this, and rural areas obviously didn't have this. It can also provide support through the business cycle. So when things, when the economy gets bad, the government kind of step up and make sure that, things are stable. Where for, private charity, it's harder to do that. When things go bad, as we saw in the Great Depression, as we even saw in the Great Recession of the last 5 years, when things get bad, people tighten their purses. They're very nervous about, donating money or spending money. And then separately, it's able to provide a very unique set of insurance through compulsion, through intergenerational sharing, through in ways that the private market can't. So, if you live longer than you expect to, that's obviously great news, except for your private savings, because, you can't suddenly start working again if you're 90 years old. And if you've exhausted your private savings, you're in a lot of trouble. However, that longevity where Social Security can step up and cover that. If you become disabled and you can't work, the federal government can step up in a way to provide support and security in a way that the private market just can't by its nature.
Assuming goodwill and enough financial support, why is it that relying only on private charity will always fail to serve everyone?
Well, so you can kind of think of it as the opposite of the positive reasons to use the government. So when you look at private charity, a lot of it tends to go to the whims of people with wealth. And so you see, gigantic donations to very wealthy schools, for instance, that don't particularly need the money, yet that's considered, charity. If you actually look at the pure dollar amount, the amount that actually gets out to people who need income support is very low out of all of the money that's donated in our country. The second is that, it's also patchy, places that have people with deep pockets, people that have communities capable of sharing are capable of doing that. But even then, it tends to be very temporary. It tends to be very focused on people who can, in fact, already work. So, there's very little support historically for people who are retired, for instance. And then it suddenly becomes just kind of a race of your private savings in the hope that you retired in a year that didn't have a housing bubble collapse or didn't have a stock market crash to really throw off your savings. And then, separately, there's something about the dignity involved, right? So you want a system that can provide for everyone as a baseline of pure economic security, where a lot of private savings are really conditioned on the idea that people, can judge and exclude, and that tends to make people who are disadvantaged, period, in the economy even more insecure and even more precarious, which is exactly what we want to avoid in these kinds of systems.
Absolutely. Now, when we're talking about the amount of charity that actually goes to the poor, what are we talking about on the dollar, and where does that go? I mean, give or take, roughly. I don't need an exact number, but I mean, how bad is it in terms of what actually gets to the poor or what doesn't get to the poor?
Well, I provide very detailed numbers in the piece, and I encourage everyone to check them out. If you're talking about private charities, about 3% of GDP. I think it's about 20 to 25% is largely what could be reasonably considered charity for the poor. Mm-hmm. And some of that will waive depending on the year and where specifically you're putting the spotlight. And crucially, that's, you compare it to the Great Recession, right? So you look at unemployment insurance, you look at food stamps, you look at what economists call automatic stabilizers, or things that kick in when the economy begins to collapse. And there you got 3% of GDP to people who really needed it within a year, which certainly prevented this Great Recession from becoming a Great Depression, and certainly helped stabilize the economy when it was in pure free fall in 2008. So right away, you can just right out the door there. Now, if you look at things like Social Security and Medicare, they essentially eliminated old age poverty. I mean, you're talking about something that had an 80% rate before the Great Depression, 80 to 60% rate going into the post-New Deal era. With the Great Society, they kind of reformed, revamped, and kind of scaled up Social Security. Obviously, added Medicare, which is health insurance for the elderly and retirees. And there you saw like a 40, 50-point reduction in poverty. So the short answer is it works by just looking at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one interesting aspect of your work is the notion that voluntarism is under-theorized. What does that mean exactly?
So, when people talk about the way markets fail, like, things like health insurance markets, for instance, economists actually have a very deep and sophisticated toolkit to understand and discuss and model and do statistics on that. So, health insurance markets might have some problems because, the sickest people will want the insurance the most and they're more likely to use it more. It's something called adverse selection. And so, that's the reasons there's an individual mandate in President Obama's healthcare reform. And then there's actually also a pretty sophisticated literature on something called public choice, or essentially government failures. And it's very popular on the right, particularly with libertarians. And you say, well, the government fails also in these very predictable ways. For instance, powerful businesses might want a regulation that protects them. And the people who benefit from that benefit that in a very concrete and concentrated way, where the people who suffer from it, everyone kind of loses a few pennies, and so they don't even notice that. And so you have these kind of, and what happens is, so you have these complicated and sophisticated ways of talking about markets and governments, and people, build careers doing that, but nobody actually takes those same tools and puts them on the private sector, or on the voluntary sector, or on charity, and say, so what are the predictable ways in which voluntarism will fail? And a few people started doing that in the 80s, and the results are so fascinating. I walk through them in the piece.
We're speaking with Mike Konczal, fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and we're discussing a recent article that he wrote in the journal Democracy about the fantasy of voluntarism and private charity replacing the social safety net. You mentioned healthcare. Healthcare is a prime example of how the private sector fails to take care of its workers and how government can do it better, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. There you see, there's where something like compulsion, or the ability of everyone to be in the pool, is particularly very important, because, if the private sector will just try to slice off the healthiest people while leaving people who were, say, for instance, born with some serious healthcare needs, or people who randomly become, through pure luck, or even through their own actions, become very sick, will kind of be left to the side, or they'll try to kick them off to the side at the first moment they get. And so it's reasons why the fact that the private sector can't compulse people into risk sharing and into insurance this way is obviously a very important reason why it fails. And crucially, it fails in a very predictable way, which is to say the people who really need the support, won't get it. And so it's something that's very peculiar to insurance markets and into support markets, and something that the government clearly has to step up in doing. And, there's a reason why so many different countries on their own paths have come up with these systems, because they're a great way to organize it, and the market and voluntarism are not.
Do you think progressives are falling down on the job of making clear how much government has done to clean up the social messes created by big business?
Yeah, obviously, I think, it's tough because it's a big movement, and there's a lot of different types of people, including politicians, including, journalists, including, editorial writers and whatnot. I think it's been much worse recently, and I think you're starting to see a movement towards a better situation. For instance, I'm very encouraged by Senator Elizabeth Warren and several other liberal senators arguing for more Social Security. I think it's been a tenet of Democrats for a decade or two, saying Social Security is a problem and we need to cut it. And though there is a long-term imbalance in the funding, the way the Democrats talk about it create this kind of hysteria about the fact that Social Security will not be there, when in fact it absolutely will be there unless we don't want it to. I think it's handled kind of fundamental challenges. I was very encouraged when George W. Bush tried to privatize Social Security, the way Democrats stood up and said, no, that's a terrible idea.
Yeah.
But that's different than saying, this is not just something that happens to work. It's a great solution and something that we could actually use more of when we see a lot of problems, for instance, in 401ks and other kind of privatized old age retirement security issues.
Progressives need to stand up taller and louder, would you say?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think there's a reason the things that they focus on work very well. There's a reason Medicare is very popular. There's a reason Social Security and income support is very popular. And, people do not want to see them cut. This was always a joke about how, Republican base voters would say, get your government hands off my Medicare, and so on and so forth. I'm nervous about how a lot of these kind of private public forms of social insurance will going forward. The ACA, Obamacare, is one of the most obvious examples of it. I think pushing for things like a public option in healthcare, or things like more Social Security, I think, and crucially, not just arguing them in technical terms, so that technically they make the right case, but also in more general terms, saying, well, actually, the public has the role here. There's a reason Republicans have worked so hard to make the word public a dirty word. But we need to reclaim it. I think it's our only way forward, really.
Okay. Mike Konczal, fellow with the Roosevelt Institute. You can check out the article in the journal Democracy about the fantasy of voluntarism and private charity replacing the social safety net. Mike, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to having you back again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congressman Mark Pocan.
Here we are on Capitol Hill. You never know who's going to stop by on their way to work in the morning. And often it's a good member of Congress and a good friend, as it is this morning. We welcome Congressman Mark Pocan from Wisconsin back in the studio this morning. Congressman, good to see you.
Great to see you, Bill. Thank you.
Good to have you in town. I don't know whether you were in the crowd last night, but Peter and I were there. Peter with his kids, me with my wife, Carol. We were cheering on the big softball game last night.
It was a victory. That's great.
I know. God, your colleagues in the Congress, they walloped the reporters 10-5.
Don't take it personally. I was rooting for the reporters.
I understand. But we were glad. It was a good victory for our team, and now we got another game next week. So
I know it's the men Democrats versus
there we get a little more
Republicans.
partisan.
Right. And hardball, not softball, huh?
Exactly. Well, and we work bipartisan. I guess the women work bipartisan, the men don't. I wonder if that's any kind of a metaphor for anything. Yeah.
Now, are you on this team?
No. Unfortunately, there are people with far more talent.
Well, I got to tell you, Peter, I just saw a little bit of the last thing, but Peter was saying that the congressional women were Republicans and Democrats on the same team. They were pretty good.
There's some big hitters.
Yeah.
There's some big hitters on that team. You could. They
who were the stars? Kirsten Gillibrand was the pitcher,
Gillibrand was the pitcher. Debbie Wasserman Schultz cranked a couple out into the outfield. Donna Edwards had a couple of good showings. Christy No,
really?
Republican. She drilled a couple. But there were a couple balls because we were out sort of an outfield because that's the best vantage point we had. And there were a couple of balls that came flying out towards our way. We were going, whoa!
Yeah.
They were way out there.
Yeah, it's very good.
When you don't pass bills, you have a little more time to practice.
There you go. Yeah, right.
That's the reality.
Now, Congressman, the president appearing in New York at a big LGBT gala the other night made a big announcement, which the crowd was very happy to hear. Here he is.
I've directed my staff to prepare for my signature an executive order prohibiting discrimination by federal contractors on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity.
This is the so-called ENDA rule, which the Congress has not acted on, and there's been a lot of pressure on the president to sign such an executive order. He finally decided to do so. This is a big deal.
Yeah, a very big deal. I mean, we've been trying to get employment non-discrimination done for a long time. I think Wisconsin was the first state in the nation, 1982, signed by a Republican governor in 1983 that passed it for gays and lesbians. At that time, we didn't have transgender included, but now most states that are doing this obviously are doing it in the most full and inclusive way. But the fact that the president is getting this done, and we requested it from the Equality Caucus, LGBT groups across the country requested it. Again, this is part of Congress not acting. If it got to the floor, I'm confident the votes are there. We have 8 Republican co-sponsors and virtually every Democrat's a sponsor, but it's getting it onto the floor past Speaker Boehner, who's representing the Tea Party folks of his caucus, not the rest of us. And because of that, the president is, again, filling the void and making sure that something gets done, and we really appreciate that.
The Faith and Freedom Coalition is out this morning with a statement. I just was reading earlier. Ralph Reed, and they have their big conference now in Washington this week, starting today. So all the Republican candidates are going to be there, and Faith and Freedom Coalition. And this is just another example of the imperial presidency, right? President basically breaking the law and going over and above the Constitution to do something, even though Congress will not do it. What I wonder is, and these other Republicans in the House, I mean, John Boehner, what is their defense of not signing this? In other words, are they really saying it's okay to discriminate against people in this country today?
I don't think
for any reason.
I don't think personally John Boehner is our problem from conversations that we've had with him and even others, like Paul Ryan, who supported previous versions of ENDA, one of a relatively small number of Republicans. But it's that, Tea Party base, again, that they have, the people that are going to go to that conference and, everyone who wants to run for president is going to be there, who feels that that's a small subset. It's less than 20% of Republicans, last I heard from some polling data that we had. But they're appealing to them because it counts like double in Republican primaries. And when you have Tea Party candidates and everything, we saw what just happened to Eric Cantor. They have a voice, a much louder voice than what they represent in society. And they have obviously a very skewed view, I think, of discrimination and how we treat people. So it's just been hard to get the leadership to put it forward because, again, the tail wags the dog in that caucus.
Yeah, I would just like to hear them say, okay, here's why we're against it. I've never heard a clear argument about it.
Well, there was one Republican member, and I'm forgetting who it was, who said, I don't know if it exists. Discrimination exists against gays and lesbians. No one's called my office. And you're kind of like, great, that's a great way to govern. But it's just kind of this idiocy that, again, part of it is they appeal and pander to that small subset that totally is around bigotry and discrimination. Yeah. And then part of it, I think, is just, their fear of actually doing anything because they're afraid of these Tea Party primaries, and part of why we don't get much done at all in Congress. I mean, last week we were halfway through the agricultural appropriations bill, which for my district means an awful lot, and all of a sudden the Cantor defeat happened and they pulled the bill. Once again, the tail just wags that dog in that caucus over and over.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't be surprised at people still having that point of view, because it wasn't so long ago. Peter, I'm blank on who it was that said about, the blacks were happy under slavery. They were better off. They used to sing in the fields, right? Just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, in this day and age, somebody would still say that.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that's part of the Tea Party phenomenon. You brought in some of these folks that maybe aren't in the mainstream of society to get elected to office, who then say things like this and have these kind of ideas and views. And it's not representative of our country, certainly not of people in the heartland. And yet, they're the ones who are speaking out, and they have these very strange views of what it used to be. I just wish if they really want to bring us back to the 50s, they'd bring us back economically to the 50s when we really brought in real revenue from the top 1% and 2%, and we had strong labor unions, and we supported workers' right to organize. And, so they want part of the 50s, but they don't want maybe the good parts of the 50s.
This is a time, he still has 2.5 years to go, but when we start assessing what a president's legacy might look like, when it comes to civil rights and LGBT issues, what's President Obama's legacy going to be?
Off the charts positive. I mean, there's been no president who's been this supportive of full equality for everyone, not just around issues of marriage. Right now, marriage equality is what most people talk around the country. In my state, in Wisconsin, we just had a judge a few weeks back, rule for marriage equality. But, we don't want people to think that that's everything. We have employment discrimination, which is why ENDA is important in the president's order for federal contractors. But in many states in this country, you can still be fired simply for being gay or lesbian. In schools, bullying, youth suicides are still very high among gays and lesbian youth. There's still a lot of issues that we've got to get to really bring us to where we need to have full inclusion. But marriage equality really has kind of grabbed most people's interest. But the president's been good across the board. Virtually every single opportunity he's had to bring this country to a better place for every single person, where you can be treated with respect and dignity and have the liberty to live your life. The president's been there absolutely as strong as possible.
Don't ask, don't tell. Forget that. Same-sex marriage, the first president to come out for marriage equality ever.
It had a huge impact when he did that.
Right. And now ENDA, right? So does that indicate to you that the political tide is changing, across the nation, not just with a liberal Democrat?
No question. In Wisconsin, in 2006, just 8 short years ago, we passed one of those hateful constitutional amendments defining marriage. We had about 37% support for marriage equality. The last poll was 55%. That's a huge change in just a little bit of time.
Whoa.
Among people 30 and under, it's like 81% support.
Wow.
So there is a true sea change. We always knew it. If you know someone who's gay or lesbian, you can realize we are just as boring as everybody else, and there's nothing too exciting out there. And yet you kind of realize that why shouldn't my husband and I have the same rights as anyone else? And if I'm really threatening anyone's marriage, they've got some other issues to figure out about rather than the fact that we're married.
It really is amazing, and I think for Republicans, let's come back to this Faith and Freedom Coalition. All these Republican candidates, would-be candidates, right, or would-be presidents, are coming into town the next couple of days to Ralph Reed and the Faith and Freedom Coalition and the religious conservatives, and they're going to be talking about these social issues, and a lot of it, as Ralph Reed indicated with this statement, thinking the president signing ENDA is wrong. It's going to be anti-gay, right? Anti-same-sex marriage, all of that. But they're speaking to a smaller and smaller share, even of the Republican Party, aren't they?
Even Grover Norquist doesn't see this as a winning issue. Scott Walker right now, who I know of no one who he gets out of the bed and he polls what he should have for breakfast. He takes a nuanced position around this right now to try to not be seen as too extreme. This is out. I've said this is the last election cycle. I think people are going to be able to really fundraise off this issue because there is even growing among Republicans and certainly independents and Democrats that this is it's only an issue if you choose to discriminate, not an issue if you're someone who has the antiquated views. So I think that they are losing this as a wedge issue, and that's a good thing. It's good that we can move on to other things. But this weekend will be interesting to watch those who still decide to pander rather than to really stand up and be statesmen, because I think standing up within the Republican Party really is pretty substantial, especially still in this issue area, and I appreciate those who do that.
Congressman Mark Pocan is with us here from Madison, Wisconsin, representing Wisconsin's 2nd District. Have you ever been to Beloit, Congressman?
Of course, that's in my district.
Oh, it's in your district?
Yeah, absolutely.
Uh-oh. Then watch out, because here's Pat from Beloit, Wisconsin. Hi, Pat.
Hi, Mark. I have met you when you were running for the congressional seat when Tammy left it, and I'm so glad that the LGBT issues are changing, but I'm more concerned at least of the other trend, which is, and I know you're sponsoring a Voting Rights Act, but we have more discrimination against segments of people in voting, and of course about unions and all these things. How do we get the tide to change, and how do we get Eric Holder to maybe get a little more assertive on defending our rights that we once had?
All right. Good question.
Yeah.
Mark?
Well, first
Thanks,
of all,
Pat. Thanks for the call.
Pat, I was in Beloit last Friday. I was a judge for a chili cook-off at a teacher's house. They have the end-of-the-year party. School ended last Friday, and I had some really good chili.
Oh,
and,
man.
So it was
See, there are all kinds of perks.
Yeah, I know.
Member of Congress,
you know what? I learned people's secret ingredients, too, afterwards that share with them, and some very unique stuff that goes into, let's just say...
All right.
I never think of peanut butter quite the same anymore.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. So and chocolate bars, but
for chili?
Yeah, interesting.
I've seen the chocolate going to chili. I've never heard of peanut butter.
Yeah.
Man, that's wild.
Oh, all right.
But important,
yes.
More important on an issue scale is voting rights. And what Pat brought up, and really important, two things. One, obviously, the Supreme Court decision last year put us in a place where we have to fix something. Even Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin is trying to make sure that we can do that fix that we need to do, and yet Congress isn't working. It's not getting it done. I think what Pat was referring to is Representative Keith Ellison and I have a constitutional amendment, a right to vote. And I think many people may not realize this, but there is not an explicit right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. It's certainly implied. They talk about discrimination in voting. But if you think about it, when it was written, 20% of the people could vote, white male property owners over 21. And we now are at a point where we want to make sure we have those protections. But since Republicans, and it is Republicans, who are going after voters because they want to pick their voters as opposed to voters picking their elected officials, have done things like photo ID. We've seen that in Wisconsin. Just most recently in Wisconsin, and I'm sure this is what Pat's referring to, is they eliminated early voting, or they reduced the amount of hours you can do. They have long lines in a lot of places, and the tougher we make it to vote, you're taking away that one thing we have that I think puts us all at an equal level in democracy is we have one vote. The Koch brothers and my brother and I, the only thing we have in common is we each have one vote. And as long as you have that, you have a democracy. When you don't have that, you don't have it. So it's a really important issue, Pat. We're working on in Congress. We've been pushing everything from Eric Holder to trying to get the constitutional amendment done to trying to get something done in a bipartisan way on the floor of Congress. We're going to keep it up. But at the same time, I think it backfired, as you know, in Wisconsin last fall. A lot of people came out to vote in parts of the state that don't normally vote. We had really high turnout because they were upset that the state was trying to push back on their right to vote. So I think that this is one where there's a citizen groundswell, and I think we can push back those who think they know better than the voters.
Just real quickly before we let you go, you have and other members of Congress have signed a letter about Brunei. What's the issue there? Well,
Brunei is one of the countries that's included in the negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, a trade deal that already is largely flawed. It's like NAFTA on steroids. But Brunei recently implemented Sharia law, which includes stoning of gays and lesbians to death and other adulterers, and they have a lot of problems with religious minorities. And to include them in a trade deal, we've done a good job in this country, I think, of trying to stand up at various times to help human rights across the world by using our power as the country that we are to be able to do that. And in a trade deal, to include them in that while we're negotiating seems wrong. So 119 members, bipartisan letter, signed a letter suggesting that we don't include them in the negotiations.
Yeah, good for you. I mean, we have to stand for something, I would hope, in our trade deals.
Absolutely, and that's a minimum level of what we should be doing.
Congressman Mark Pocan.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Sandra Hanson, Mike Konczal, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.